In our study of the life divine, Sri Aurobindo is describing the nature of the spiritual evolution as spiritual being emerges out of mental being. The process has to be understood in two aspects. First, what exactly is spiritual being and how is it different from mental being? And second, what are the means and methods by which it can emerge? In the text we have studied so far, he has made a clear distinction between what is spirituality and, in contrast, what is still a part of the evolution in the mental consciousness, even if it is preparatory towards the spiritual. In the passage we are at now, Sri Aurobindo describes the double character of the spiritual evolution. There is an external surface, machinery, we may say, of the body, life and mind, which has to grow to become capable of containing and expressing the spiritual consciousness. And there is parallelly the evolution of the soul as it grows to higher and higher levels, which it can then express through this surface personality. And this double evolution is justified if the goal of evolution was to manifest the spirit, to transform life and mind and even matter in terms of its values, its principles and its power. If that was not the case, then all this would be unnecessary. You would only simply step out and leave life to enter spirit. But having justified the need for this double evolution, he says even for this purpose it is indispensable. He now brings forward the problems which come with the double evolution. He says, this however imposes a difficult and slow spiritual advance. For first, the spiritual emergence has to wait at each step for the instruments to be ready. Next, as the spiritual formation emerges, it is mixed inextricably with the powers, motives, impulses of an imperfect mind, life and body. So on one point we see that it is as if spirit emerging has to wait for nature to make sure the biology and the mind has caught up before it can step forward. A point which he made earlier, that until the human mind comes into its own, the spiritual evolution cannot be possible. It needs the basis for the mental awareness in which and through which it can develop the spiritual awareness. So, the monkey consciousness, for example, cannot enter directly the consciousness of the spirit unless it develops sufficiently this link point of a mental awareness. And so, nature has to wait. Earth has had to wait for this step in human evolution to reach a sufficient basis of mind before we could begin the journey into the spiritual age. And so there is a question of delay because of the reliance on instruments. But the second problem, he says, is that what is emerging as spirit is so heavily mixed that the mixture pulls down spirit or even can seriously distort the spiritual emergence. He says, mixed inextricably with the powers, motives, impulses. Mind has its power of intelligence, and the intellect tries to assert itself on the spirit. So if a higher spiritual emergence begins to take place, the mind immediately catches it and reduces it to its own working. A very common form in which this takes place is in the phenomenon that we call genius, where a first emergence of intuition has begun, and the mind is as if able to leap forward to an insight, and immediately the intellect catches this leap forward, reduces it to an operation of mind, and says, my mind is more fast, more plastic, more intelligent. But it reduces it and prevents the free emergence of intuition. It's a very common problem that while the pure intuition is trying to come out, the repeated tendency of mind to reduce blocks and prevents. This is one example. Motives, the emotions, desires can come up, and as the spiritual consciousness begins to emerge, they catch that and use it for their own justification. It can take a very serious form if the ego actually takes the spiritual consciousness and uses it as a concealment for its own motives. And this is often seen in life, and which comes out often as a failure of a famous guru or teacher who had put forward a persona which seemed to fit all the requirements or expectations of humanity to be spiritual, but behind was a pretty well hidden drive of personal ambition and desire and need to build whatever he needed. And then at some point it does creep out, and when it's exposed, the whole thing falls apart. But it doesn't mean the person didn't have anything of the spiritual. There was one example I recall because it was so vivid, where I was shown a book of a new famous godman who had just become popular in the collective consciousness. And the book had photos of his life in his childhood and his later years. And I remember seeing, and the picture is still so vivid, he was sitting in his childhood, seated under a tree, and there was a gaze in his eyes, and I saw that and I said, this is something so familiar. There was a depth and even a certain vastness and opening, even at least a beginning of a cosmic consciousness in that presence, in the aura of the person. And then you turn 2 pages and here was somebody who was looking through the eyes, so proud, so full of himself, that it was almost repulsive. And the difference was stark. And I said, what a pity. Had he stayed on his path, he could have gone so far. And having had an experience, he moves forward to now start teaching or to preach and become a leader. And all the distortions of his unrefined personality just caught that little experience and perverted it. And soon after, I heard he was caught in some scandals and there was a fall. More recently, I met somebody who spoke of an unusual experience he had. And he had the experience in an unexpected moment of a flooding light that descended in his own being, and it was something so astonishing. For a few days he was living in this wonderful experience, and then it faded away, never to come. Now, many years later, his concern was, what should I do about it? Should I start teaching? And I said, what will you teach? Well, all about my experience. And I said, have you had it later? He said, no. And then later again he said, I know everything about light. And I said, how quickly the mind can jump when it doesn't have a reference of what the experience was or what more remains to be done. And so I just left it to him, saying, perhaps you should spend more time to remember that experience and try to recover it and begin to live in it. And then what you speak or what you share will come from a living force of experience. And it had not struck him. I said, oh yeah, that makes sense. But the motives, impulses, which are so common to the normal desire nature. Here I've got something, can I commercialize it? Can I build my life, desire, passions, needs around this new gem? And so a downward gravitation and perilous mixture. This is where the mix becomes dangerous. But the tendency to pull down is part of this human nature. A constant temptation to fall or deviation. And these examples are enough. At least a fettering where you're bound, a part of you, as if your ankles are tied down while some higher part continues to soar, and at some point it creates such a strong division on consciousness that there is a tearing or even a split, as if, except your personality cannot split, and so it creates a violent oscillation between two states, high and low, or it leads to a breakdown of the personality and an imbalance. And this is the problem of the fettering, a weight, a retardation. And unfortunately, the retardation, as in the example I mentioned earlier, it means perhaps the opportunity of that growth which had begun is lost or greatly postponed. And so the result of all this, he points out, inevitably as a result of these mixtures, there is a necessity to return upon a step gained in order to bring up something of the nature which hangs back and prevents a farther step. You gain a step, you have to go back, and all the things which are now hampering have to be lifted up so that another step can be taken, and again going back to lift, and so on. This is something interesting, especially in the life of those who seek sustained spiritual development, that every now and then you look back at all the things which you have been doing, the very things which got you to the spiritual experience or the progress. And you need to review and recast. Sometimes completely throw out an activity in order to re-express based on a new consciousness. I recall somebody who used to spend 3 hours every day in japa and ritual practices, which would give him a high, and it sustained him for a while. And then at some point, when he broke through to a higher stage, I asked him, what do you do? He said, I still do my 3 hours. And I said, do you need it? And he thought, and he said, not really. I said, how much do you need minimum? He said, 1 hour. I said, great, start with your 1 hour now and then move on to the deepening of your experience. But one does not stop to think, because the very nature of the earlier habit binds you. Even it may be at some point that you discard everything. This may happen at a very advanced stage. Sri Aurobindo shares an experience where he was deep in sadhana. Remember, this is a time when there was a rapid ascension towards the supramental consciousness, and there was as if a block, a pause. Things were no more moving forward, and there was nothing happening. Perhaps it was an integration or a deepening, but there was no further forward progress. And as he sat there in the evening with a cup of tea before him, there was a strange mendicant sadhu who was considered to be crazy, who was walking on the road. He suddenly stops in front of the door of Sri Aurobindo's house, guest house as it was called. He enters, comes up the stairs, comes up to Sri Aurobindo, and there is the teacup in front of Sri Aurobindo. This sadhu takes the teacup, throws down the tea, puts back the empty cup, and walks out and continues in his journey. And Sri Aurobindo said it was the clue that he needed. And the clue, he says, was the cup has to be emptied before it can be refilled. And with that, his sadhana rapidly moved forward. But this is the key insight which often happens to us in our journey. When we are blocked, or when there is too much of the backlog of the past hanging on, we have to turn back, discard much of it, recast, reshape. But in particular, in terms of consciousness, we lift everything now to the new level so far attained, which allows us to move to higher. Finally, so the point he makes, that thing which hangs back prevents a farther step, and that's why it needs to be lifted up. Finally, there is by the very character of mind in which it has to work, a limitation of the emerging spiritual light and power, and a compulsion on it to move by segments. So first problem is the mind being in substance more dull than the spiritual light and power, which is much more fine and clear. And between these two, the light settling into the mind dulls the light. You rise above the mind and you have a clear perception of the light and power of the spirit. You shift back into the light and you shift back into the mind and there's a dulling. You let your awareness return to the physical body and everything is gone. It feels as if you have lost everything. Once again you interiorize or go deep and you find everything is intact. It's as if the material into which this consciousness or experience has to settle dulls and reduces. But the second problem is that the mind cannot open out to the multifaceted, wide, free action of spirit. It is used to moving in grooves, in little pieces, in some aspects. And so it catches an aspect of the experience and focuses only on that. Or catches another and limits itself to that and says, this is it or this is all. Compulsion on it to move by segments. And he explains, to follow one line or another and leave altogether or leave till later on the achievement of its own totality. You cannot as if grow into the totality of the spirit because you're so focused on one aspect. This is often the case with those who have very rigid, structured and narrow practices. Any system, any religion, any practice or form which is too narrow and too structured inevitably binds you to an aspect or limits you to just that structure, that form. And often the religion or philosophy or practice distinguishes itself by that and even declares this is it and this is all to the divine. And so it has to leave altogether the fullness, or sometime later one moves into a greater fullness. The problem of the mind rising into fullness is even when it thinks it has got a fullness, it doesn't realize the true fullness is after. Because often the experience is so overwhelming, you can stop and say, this is it, I have reached. This hampering, this obstacle of the mind, life and body is an impediment so great and intolerable that the spiritual urge becomes impatient and tries rigorously to quell these opponents. Here's the problem, the spirit emerging, the urge rising, and all these things blocking and limiting. What are the things blocking and limiting? And here's a parenthetical statement. When he says, obstacle of mind, life and body, and he elaborates, the heavy inertia and persistence of the body. This is the first obstacle. You have this high experience, you come back into your body awareness, surface awareness, and everything dulls down. Or you're full of the afflatus. This is a common experience all of us have on our birthday. You're full of the afflatus, it's full. Maybe you've been to Aurobindo room, you have had a wonderful communion, meditation, whatever. You go to sleep, maybe an afternoon nap. You wake up and everything is back to its original dullness. If nothing else, the night sleep is enough to knock out everything. You wake up in the morning, where is it gone? And that's body, inertia, and the persistence of the body's tendency to stay where it was. One can look at it another way. The very same persistence of the body, if you include the body in the spiritual experience and can somehow awaken it to share in that higher, then it will persist in what it receives of the higher. That very persistence which holds you back can now be made a means for stabilizing the experience of the higher consciousness. In the integral yoga, this is so essential. And that's why you will see the mother repeatedly coming back to the body and its participation and its foundation for the spiritual development. Anything that is now settled in the body now becomes for you permanent, and its persistence, power of persistence now can be brought into the spiritual development. For the life, he gives another list of problems. The turbid passions of the life part. Passion has its own impulsiveness. It chases, it goes. I want, I don't want, I react, I revolt. And all these can even be turned to spiritual. I want the spiritual. And the passionateness itself creates an agitation that covers and blocks and prevents. And it seizes on something with so much agitation that the agitation breaks it up. And experience begins to dawn, it's coming, and you exult, and that dims, limits, or distorts. And that's the aspect of passion. And then there's the turbidity of the passion, which makes it clouded and mixed with your emotions, with your desires, with your likes and your dislikes. And all of that distorts very quickly. The most common thing which is mixed with the turbidity of passion is the touch of the divine love. The moment it enters and touches the emotions, straight away the emotions want to seize and fill into the normal patterns that it has associated with the human love, and depending on what it meant by habit for the human love, it wants to channel it, to fill it. And so it was a very interesting observation that was made by a great Sufi teacher in America. He was contrasting the circumstances in America from generally Europe or the East. And he said, here there is no respect for the position of the teacher. And the disciples want to have closeness and intimacy in the way they are used to. So they feel the call or the attraction of the spiritual light, and then they want to reduce it to a more human, emotional, sentimental relation, even demanding or insisting that unless they have that, they cannot progress spiritually. And some interesting discussions like this he makes between the difference in culture. But this is a part of the tendency of the life energies, turbid passion of the life part. And for the mind, he lists a series of difficulties. The obscurity and doubting incertitudes, denials, other formulations of the mind. Obscurity of mind is, of course, mind unable to maintain its quality of awareness and perception. Even when there is a spiritual experience, the mind, being normally so dull and unclear, is unable to register the full imprint. And at best, I felt a little light, I felt a little happy, and that's all that it can keep. Or the doubting incertitude which follows because of the obscuring. Is it a spiritual experience, or was it because of the high sugar that I had for breakfast? Or I had good news in the morning, so I'm feeling a little light, and maybe that's what it is. Or denials. It cannot be. It's not possible. I must have imagined it. How often have we had such thoughts also? And other formulation. The word formulation is binding into form, limiting into something which is a familiar structure of the mind. And this is one of the most difficult problems of mind, because it is an instrument of finiteness. Any glimpse of the infinite, it will reduce to form and finiteness. And if it cannot reduce or fit into a form, it will as if not register that, or register as a blank. Mother even makes this observation. If the mind as it is were to have a glimpse of the supramental sun, it would be unable to perceive it and would register it as black. Why? Because the consciousness of the supramental is a consciousness of infinity. How does mind grasp infinity? With what will it compare? Because it needs to compare, it needs to reduce, it needs to cut up something which is indivisible and infinite. So it sees it as black. Or an aspect of the infinite which it is able to capture, it will take that and then reduce it to the way it understands. I remember two experiences because they're very recent. In an exercise of concentration, and this took place in Europe. We were with a group and there was a meditation, and one of the persons went unconscious. It was a strong presence, but she went unconscious. And so I asked her, "What happened to you?" She said, "I felt this presence descending, and then I tried to channel it into such and such passage within." And why? Well, that's what she was used to doing. So she felt something, now you channel it. So you try to reduce something, force it into a passage, and of course it overwhelmed her system. And in another group, when a similar experience was had, the lady came up to me and said, "I felt such an intense presence around the head that I thought maybe it's a contraindication. So I stopped the experience and opened my eyes." I said, "What do you mean contraindication?" And, "Well, it was too strong." So she had been taught, because I don't know, in her classes, or maybe she had a medical background, that certain experiences may not suit you. And so it's too strong, so it must not be suiting me. Contraindication. The mind could not recognize that a genuine contact with the spirit may be overwhelming, may be too felt like this. But these are formulations, reduction to existing forms, ideas, and you try to fit everything. And so he says, an impediment so great and intolerable to the spiritual urge that the spiritual urge becomes impatient and tries rigorously to quell these opponents. What do you mean by quell? You push them down, suppress them, wash them out, silence them. So to quell these opponents, to reject the life, to mortify the body, to silence the mind and achieve its own separate salvation. Now these are three things he just spoke of: the body, life and mind. So what do you do with these three? So generally, life you reject. You say, every time that I come back to life, I meet people, I engage with my work, I lose my inner poise. So I would rather stay retired, separate and withdraw. So you go into a cave, you become a recluse and so on, in which perhaps you're able to maintain a little bubble of some higher refined state. But notice what happens. You may try to retire from life. Life doesn't let you. It pursues you. If nothing else, you have to get food. And you may have someone bringing food, and then after a while, in your fine, subtle sensitivity, the person who brings the food is a problem. Or the food that has come is now too dulling, and now I need it to be made by XYZ, or I need to change the food so that it can sustain my sensitivity. You get more and more withdrawn until at some point it's as if you must withdraw from everything, which is not possible. And inevitably you end up with the same frustration. So it was the mother's constant insistence that withdrawal never solves the problem. Of course, you make a strategic withdrawal. You do not deliberately engage with the things which have a powerful dulling and limiting effect. But within what you have to live with, you continue and develop and strengthen the poise of the spiritual experience so that it can fill life rather than withdraw. But the first tendency to reject life. Second, he says, to mortify the body. And you see this in many of the ascetic religious forms. You beat down the body. In some of the most extreme Jain practices, they will even, in the transition to the ascetic life, they will pull out one by one each hair and accept the pain, or use the pain as a point of separation to feel as if the body is to be abandoned and to be made dull and insensitive so that it ceases to be a burden. Or food, which would be attractive and pull your senses and perhaps awaken desire, should just be mashed up and mixed into something so flat and meaningless and tasteless that you will not have desire. Or, as many of the Christian monks would do, whip themselves Every time the body had a desire or some impulse which is contrary to that decision or the spiritual ideal, you whip yourself to punish the body so that it may not do it again. In the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Krishna points to these kinds of ascetic practices and says that when you punish the body, you punish me who is in the body. And suddenly your perspective changes. Your body is not something to be punished. It is not something to be beaten down or mortified. It is the sacred temple in which the divine presence has to be invoked, and the temple has to be made pure so that the presence may fill it more and more completely. And this is the reversal in the approach which is integral, that accepts life. Third problem is with the mind. To silence the mind and achieve its own separate salvation. You want to get out of this mind's tendency to limit, well, you silence it and pull out. You will see this in certain more extreme Buddhist practices of the particularly Hinayana tradition, or what is now called Theravada. It is essential part of practices such as Vipassana meditation, where the whole goal is to separate as an observer in order to shut down the mind and kill it eventually. But as a first step, you separate so that you can quiet it in order to kill. But if the goal is for the mind to become a vehicle for the divine knowledge, then the same first step of quieting the mind is used to now open it to a higher, wider presence and a higher light that can fill the mind and teach it to become wide and subtilize, raise, and even transform its substantial material into something more divine. And instead of achieving a separate salvation, you actually experience the divine presence more and more filling the mind. So all these approaches which impatiently the spiritual urge tries to now exercise, he says, end up with spirit departing into pure spirit and rejecting from it altogether an undefined and obscure nature. And this is the way of the ascetic. Now, Sri Aurobindo is giving you this because here is the key to understand why there was an ascetic phase, why it was justified. In the first emergence of the spirit from the human, in the human consciousness, in the human mind, where the mind was still not sufficiently ready to be able to receive spirit into it, this urgency and this impatience led to this kind of an attempt to withdraw. Apart from the supreme call, the natural push of the spiritual part in us to return to its own highest element and status, this aspect of vital and physical nature as an impediment to pure spirituality is a compelling reason for asceticism, for illusionism, for the tendency to otherworldliness, the urge towards withdrawal from life, the passion for a pure and unmixed absolute. Here's the justification. And in a few key words, he describes the turn of human spirituality in the last 2,500 years about. The natural push of the spiritual part in us to return to its own highest element and status. This aspect of vital and physical nature as an impediment to pure spirituality is a compelling reason for asceticism. So when we have this turn, you look back at the nature and its limitation, well, asceticism is justified. But it is justified only when it is apart from the supreme call. And the supreme call is for the complete realization of the divine in his transcendence, in his universality, in his individuality, in the aspect of the divine in silence as well as the divine in manifestation, in action, in form. But apart from that supreme call, this natural push of the spiritual part in us to return to its highest element, when it looks at this aspect of vital and physical nature as a barrier, well, it says it's justified. What is justified? And he gives three words. First, asceticism. Second, illusionism. Third, tendency to otherworldliness. And you will see this is the sequence in which the spirituality turned, beginning with first Buddhism, where the Buddha realized that the solution, the shortest solution, the shortest way to freedom from suffering was emergence in the absolute, and for that purpose you had to withdraw from the relative. And he established that whole turn of the asceticism, and it became the very nature of Buddhism. There is a later form in which Buddhism began to embrace life also. You see that in the Mahayana, in the Tibetan tradition, where something of the Tantric tradition mixed with the Buddhist. And the Tantra, as you know, aspired to realize the divine in life. And so something of that mixed with Buddhism to create a kind of a mixture. But still the head of the tradition is an ascetic. The Dalai Lama is a monk who wears the monk's robes. And the ideal in the tradition is still to join the monk order. And those who live in life look towards that as the goal. And so the sense of asceticism is your first turn, which says, well, you will not find the solution here, and the solution not being here, you have to get out of here to find the solution there. Shankaracharya, who drove out Buddhism because it did not fit in the ideal of the civilization of the Vedic formulation in India, had to literally defeat Buddhism through debate and drive it out of India. Still, in the process of doing it, in the very nature of the debate, he had to accept the point that the solution could not be found here. Because how do you bring that freedom that you have there from suffering? Here you can't. The suffering seems to be intractable. And his solution was to say, well, the suffering which you have here is an illusion, because the world is an illusion. That is the reality. So the second aspect, the sister or brother of this truth, is illusionism, that still says that here you cannot have divinity. It's only there. But there is no here. There is only divinity. There is no other, but there is no here. This is an illusion. And so this is one of those stepping stones from the ascetic approach towards an embracement of life, which says the world is illusion. And the mother qualifies this, saying, yes, there is a truth to it. The world is illusion in the way you perceive it. The way you see is illusory, but there is a reality to the world which you can perceive, and that reality is Satchidananda. And so that reality there is also here. So you can see how illusionism can be a stepping stone. And so in the sequence in India, you find subsequent to Shankaracharya is Madhvacharya and Ramanuja and others who come subsequently, who declare this too is divine. Sarvam khalu idam Brahman. All this truly is Brahman, not falsely, not in appearance alone. It is truly Brahman. And so the attempt now to re-engage with life and discover or bring something of that spirituality into life. But still, in the very imprint of the first two, the asceticism and the illusionism, there's such a strong imprint that the tendency to otherworldliness remains. Even though you speak of divine in life, or you speak of life becoming a vehicle, in practice it takes the form as if life supports the spirit, but is not itself spiritual. And so the image given is of a candle flame. The flame cannot exist or cannot be manifest unless you have the candle and the wick on which the flame sits. Take out the wick and the flame vanishes. You want spirituality in life? Well, you need the wick. But the wick, your body, is never flame. It remains always dark. And under the flame is the darkness. So somehow there has not been sufficiently this completeness of the bridging or the divinization, at least as an idea. The Tantra comes with this idea that here in the body I can experience the divine, the body itself and my life and my mind and everything can experience intimacy with the divine presence. How long did it last? Very rapidly it got warped into the powers that came in opening to the power of nature, and they lost themselves in power. The higher purpose is largely forgotten, or where it remains, still the idea of body as a support tends to predominate, and not the full acceptance of body and matter as an essentially divine principle which can even reveal divinity. You don't see that. Even in the tantric traditions as they survive, we still have the worship of the Divine Mother in the Sri Vidya tradition, for example. And what is interesting to see as a result of all these three phases, the complete neglect of life, neglect of form. And it's sometimes quite disturbing to see in India. You go to the most ancient temples, they are so beautiful, made by people who wanted to literally carve divinity into stone or reveal divinity from the stone. And then you see the people living there today, the temple is dirty, or they repair and they put a slab of cement, an ugly patch. And couldn't you do it more neatly? Couldn't you make it integrate? Couldn't you express it aesthetically? Somehow that thing is lost. And it has to be recovered. The urge towards withdrawal from life, the passion for a pure and unmixed absolute, and against which the world seems to be impure or mixed spirituality. And in all this, Aurobindo is justifying or showing you the justification for that turn. And it needed, and we must understand the importance of this, it needed for humanity to pass through this phase. For the mind to be sufficiently spiritualized or prepared and subtilized that it could now become a more direct vehicle for the spiritual experience. And it could not be done perhaps 2,500 years ago or 2,000 years ago or maybe even 500 years ago. And all that period, all that passage helped for that spiritual influence to settle into the mind, to settle into the life, and even into the forms of life. As you see in India particularly, the religious forms, so deeply embedded, almost everything anyone does has a spiritual aspect or a background or a philosophical insight or even a yogic principle behind. So deeply integrated that from within, it as if turns the whole consciousness and makes ready a stage where this whole life and mind and even the activities of life could turn now to embrace spirit. The extremist of this absolutism, look at his vocabulary, the solitary, the ascetic, is the standard bearer of the spirit. No. First phrase he uses, extremist of this absolutism. So you can have an absolutism that says, yes, the absolute is there. You can't experience the absolute here. Let's take that as provisionally possible, provisionally true. But then you can say, all right, but I can still accept to have a spirituality in life, to lift life as close as possible to the absolute. But the extremist says, no, even that is not. And so he calls it the extremist of this absolutism. For him, the standard bearer is the ascetic. The extremist of the absolutism is the standard bearer for this approach. And the solitary, the ascetic, is the standard bearer of the spirit. His ochre robe is its flag, the sign of a refusal of all compromise. Again, Sri Aurobindo brings such depth to it. You see, the ochre robe has been the symbol in India of the renunciation of the ascetic. The man who no more belongs to the world. he now belongs only to the spirit, or at least in his seeking, in his aspiration. And so such a person, life and tradition accepts, is not bound by any condition of life. He can do as he pleases because he is free from conditions and limitations of life. He can break the rules of life, do what he likes, because he is free. But in practice, of course, the one who takes the ochre robe is not yet free. He's only chosen a life which will lead to that freedom. But that choosing has been uncompromising. I will not allow anything of my life limitations to stay with me. In practice, of course, today this doesn't happen. You will meet the sannyasi wearing ochre robes, and perhaps he's very much into life. He has his mobile phones, he has his bank accounts, and his other things, maybe even driving a car, which he owns in his name, which the sannyasi technically cannot have any ownership of anything because he is free of the world. But it's interesting to see how, when Tibetan Buddhism was driven out of Tibet by Chinese invasion, it was forced to face life to such a degree that now the Tibetan Buddhist is using all the equipment of life, including the computers and the internet and the tools for teaching, preaching, building extraordinary, beautiful monasteries all over the world to teach that knowledge which will liberate the mind. And it was as if it was forced to engage with life, but from this still renounced state of the robe of the monastic. But Sri Aurobindo gives to it such a deep insight. He says, the character of the ochre robe, the flag, is the sign of a refusal of all compromise. Today the ochre robe has got a bad name because of the misuse of the symbol. But if you see behind the symbol is this idea, I will not compromise. And if you accept the truth of it, you will say, this is not contrary to the integral yoga. The uncompromising commitment to the spirit is something you can accept, but it will be uncompromising in its extreme that says you will not compromise even to refuse spirit in life. You will see spirit in life also. You can give it a different form. And at that point, the ochre robe as a symbol is no more necessary. And Sri Aurobindo highlights not the external renunciation of life, but what is the true character of the renunciation? The inner renunciation of ego and desire. And this is what it means to be a renunciate from the perspective of the integral yoga. And the external form is pointless then, because life is your field for the renunciation of ego and desire. So I'm repeatedly bringing this aspect. We come back to the text where he is highlighting this negative renunciation, as indeed the struggle of emergence cannot end by compromise. When the spirit is trying to emerge from mind, it's not going to say, all right, this is all I can do, and I will accept a partial emergence. What does it have to do? But only by an entire spiritual victory and the surrender of the lower nature. So here's a vocabulary which is belonging properly to war: victory and surrender. When spirit emerges out of mind, life and body, it must come entirely victorious in terms of the spirit. But what happens for the rest? This material has to become completely surrendered. What does it mean to be completely surrendered? It gives up all its existing laws, all its existing culture, all its existing civilization, all its existing principles of working, and accepts the law of the spirit, the culture of the spirit, the forms of the spirit as its own. That's the complete surrender. And you can see from the perspective of the integral yoga what a beautiful image it is. Your body will no more live by the law of inertia, but by the peace of the spirit, of which inertia is a degradation. Your life energy will no more live by the passion of its desire, but by the power of the spirit, of which passion is a perversion. Your mind will no more live by its finite narrowness, but open to the infinite light of spirit and become its vehicle. And what is left of mind, life, and body? No more of the old, but it is born anew into spirit and by law of spirit. So the complete surrender of the lower nature and an entire spiritual victory is what is necessary. And so from the ascetic point of view, when this is attempted, complete victory of spirit, if that is impossible here, then indeed it must be achieved elsewhere. If nature refuses submission to the emerging spirit, then the soul must withdraw from her. And this is logical, and this is acceptable. If nature refuses submission, if it cannot be achieved here. And there's the if. And Sri Aurobindo now picks on this and brings it to a grand unification. There is thus a dual tendency in the spiritual emergence. On one side, a drive towards the establishment at all costs of the spiritual consciousness in the being, even to the rejection of nature. On the other side, a push towards extension of spirituality to our parts of nature. So this is now the double reality tendency. As spirit emerges, it will reject nature or whatever nature it cannot accept, of whatever part of nature refuses to submit, and it will come out at all costs into the spiritual consciousness of being, no compromise with anything lesser. On the other side, even as it's trying to come out into this, it must try to infuse its influence into nature. And so you have a double movement, upward and a downward. Extension of spirituality to our parts of nature. But notice the vocabulary. Spirituality extending into the lower parts is also an impulse of the spirit. Spirit's impulse to come out, but also spirit's impulse is to fill. Even if these lower parts don't accept. They may not accept for spirit to emerge, they may not accept to spirit to fill, but spirit needs both these movements. And so the idea is this: true spirituality cannot be one-sided. If you choose a one-sided spirituality which only withdraws and does not recognize the movement of spirit trying to express, you've chosen to be blind, because inherent to spirit is the need to express. As you can see in the example earlier of the Buddhist culture that was driven out of Tibet, it needed to express, not only to recreate its forms, and you will see on the west coast of the United States a series of monasteries of the Tibetan teachers who came and settled in the US, each more beautiful than the other. You go to Tibet, you will not find the same beauty and the same aesthetic. But coming into the United States, it took a different form. And they tried to bring that something of the vision of the spirit. And I remember going to one of these where we were in the retreat center and then the main monastery was on the other side of the hill. From one side you looked at the other, literally you had the glimpse as if a heavenly form of golden spires floating in the mist. And it was as if a glimpse of the reality from below. And you could feel the vibration of the high Tibetan ideals of that culture. They brought it. And the second aspect was to teach, to spread the teaching. That itself is an impulse of spirit to want to spread into the mind of humanity, isn't it? And if you don't recognize that it is an impulse of the spirit, you're ignoring the truth. You can pretend as if you want to withdraw and that's all you want, and pretend that this is only being done because it's necessary. No, it's an impulse of spirit which wants to fulfill. And the moment you accept that, the whole nature of the spirituality changes. But now comes between these two movements, how do you practically relate one to the other? But until the first is fully achieved, the second can only be imperfect and halting. If the foundation of the pure spiritual, it is the foundation of the pure spiritual consciousness that is the first object in the evolution of the spiritual man. And it is this, and the urge of that consciousness towards contact with the reality, the self or the divine being, that must be the first and foremost. And we understand why now. Until the first movement of the spirit coming into its own fully is achieved, how do you expect spirit to infuse itself into mind, life and body? Or if it does infuse, it will necessarily be, he uses two words here, imperfect and halting. So it infuses, here you have a beautiful experience, you infuse into mind, life, body, you reshape them now to express this new poise. Well, what have you done? It's not yet the full liberated spirit that is expressed, but a mix, something imperfect. And if you stop and say, now I have expressed spirituality in life, well, very quickly life will show you all your ignorance and limitations. On the other hand, if you try to bring the full force of your experience into these, very quickly you hit a roadblock. I can't push beyond this point. The inertia of the body pushes back. The impulse of desire nature can only take so much. Beyond that, it can overwhelm you. And the mind, of course, can only articulate within limits. So there is the halting block. But if you were to go all the way to the full spiritual emergence, where now spirit is completely free and liberated, it brings the full power of the spirit, and at that point the halting roadblock is no more, because the full power of spirit is stronger than limitation of mind, life and body. And it can cut through any roadblock, dissolve them, and take up any resistance and make as perfect as it wants. So here's a claim made. Is it true? You can say spirituality is all powerful. Is it true? Sri Aurobindo's logic is always fully satisfying. He says, where did this mind, life and body come from? It was formed by the power of the spirit in involution, isn't it? If spirit has created life, mind, life and body, then spirit can recast them and reshape them into its own terms, isn't it? But it needs the highest poise of spirit from where that creation emerged to be able to overcome. This is the way Sri Aurobindo articulates it. Only the highest supramental consciousness can overcome the resistance of the physical consciousness. But all the way to the most physical, even the overmental consciousness can transform mind and life to a divinized, not yet perfect, but divinized poise. But in the physical body, it can only push so far, after which it hits a limit. Because the overmental is still a fragmented consciousness, the beginning of ignorance. And above, in the highest supramental, is the oneness, in which there is no division. Only that can overcome the physical, because that alone has the full power, and the physical body cannot resist. The mother once represented this. You see, she was also trying to bring these high truths into the life of the children of the ashram. So often these would be represented through activities. And there was a presentation of the bodybuilding group, and they had these young, muscular, formed, sculpted bodies. They were demonstrating, taking positions, and often the position of a muscle to be revealed, or the whole body to be revealed, is a position of tension or stress. Otherwise you can't fully express this. So they would take positions, and mother is seeing this from her consciousness, and in each position she saw a profound symbol. So then she arranged these positions in a certain way to make for a story. And the story goes something like this. I don't remember, I think there were 4 or 5 steps, but it goes something like this. First, matter turns down. So it is a man lying down, curled up, with his muscles bloated. And up there, spirit approaches and gives a hand. But matter refuses. Then spirit reaches out and holds the hand of matter and pulls. Matter is held but turns away. It tries to show its strength against spirit. And then spirit exercises its power and pulls matter. And matter realizes that spirit is greater than its power. And so it is surprised and it yields. And at some point in the fourth position, spirit reveals itself and matter accepts that spirit is its fulfillment. Meaning all that matter has sought to realize and express, it can now truly express only with that power of spirit which is now greater than itself. And now it knows it can be truly the nature of true matter, divine matter. So at that last stage, matter fully accepts spirit and embraces spirit. So all this was shown in two beings in their bodybuilding positions. It's quite fascinating if you can ever get hold of those pictures. How Mother used the most ordinary representation of the physical body to give to it a spiritual turn. But remember, the whole thing was for bodybuilders in the physical body. And the message was, work on your body for this purpose. Awaken in your body this turn to the spirit and the acceptance of the spirit, and let the body yield fully and embrace spirit. Who can do that in all the matter of the universe? Out there are billions, trillions of galaxies, each full of so many planets, each full of so many plants and animals and humans or intelligent beings. Well, just stay with our earth. What on our earth? Which part of matter can turn and recognize spirit, give itself and embrace spirit? There's only one thing. Stones cannot do it, plants cannot do it, animals cannot do it. Only human beings who are conscious of the spirit with a conscious spiritual aspiration. The whole universe is waiting for this moment where it can express in matter this aspiration for life, for the spirit, and embrace spirit in matter. And where will this take place first? In the human form in which the spiritual consciousness has been sufficiently established. And that will be the substance of matter that will enter in relation to spirit and embrace spirit. If you look at the whole humongous mass of the universe, from the perspective of the universe's aspiration, which is the most precious material, is your human body, or the part of your human body in which the spiritual aspiration is sufficiently awakened. How much of that is in you? Can you increase that? Can your body grow more and more to participate in this aspiration? And for the whole universe, this will be the most precious part of this universe and all the matter in the universe. From the human perspective of sight, we are a tiny speck on the edge of the galaxy in a tiny little planet on a relatively tiny sun, and our body is so tiny, a little whiff of the gust of wind can blow it away. But from the perspective of the spirit and perspective of the universe, this is the most precious substance. The most precious substance, and now think of it from perspective of time, which is the most precious moment of your life, where your consciousness turns in aspiration to the divine, feels itself in relation to the divine, remains in communion to the divine, and moves to merging to whatever degree. Those are the most precious moments of your life, and for the soul, that the soul will remember and carry with it, when it otherwise will simply shed this body, life-mind complex. But those moments it will carry, and that will be its nourishment for the work which it has been struggling over billions of years, to build a vehicle in which it can fully manifest divinity and in which the vehicle itself can become divine. So I put this in the context of the choreography that Mother made for the bodybuilding team. And this, we come back to the text. Until the first is fully achieved, the second can only be imperfect and halting. So, what is the first that we have to achieve? It is the foundation of the pure spiritual consciousness that is the first object in the evolution of the spiritual man. And it is this and the urge of that consciousness towards contact with the reality, the self, or the divine being that must be the first and foremost. Or even till it is perfectly established, the sole preoccupation of the spiritual seeker. Now we are coming to the nature of the work we have to do and the prioritization we have to give to it. We have to reach to a foundation of pure spiritual consciousness. How will we get to that? What does it mean to get to that? And that's the first object of the evolution of the spiritual man. This foundation and the urge towards this immersion with the divine. This is our first work. But that divine we can approach in three different ways because there are three aspects to it. He puts three words here. The urge of that consciousness towards contact with the reality, capital R. Second, the self, capital S. Or third, the divine being, capital D and B. There are three different approaches, three ways of relating to the divine. In the first, which is the most impersonal, is the sense that there is a reality. What you're seeing of it is the distortion, perversion, or even illusion. You say, and science is very much in line with this, you're at no point going in contradiction to science. Science tells you what? You're looking at a piece of metal. No, it's not metal. It's not wood. It's not stone. It's actually molecules. You think it's static? No, it's actually whirling subatomic particles. You think it's matter? No, it's not. It's pure energy whirling. That's science telling you. What yoga had always said. What you're looking at is not what it appears. And science comes back to exactly the same thing. It's whirling energy, nothing static, nothing moving. And then it goes a little further. You take your heavy piece of metal or stone, and science says, if you look at the whirling particles, the volume of the particles of energy, and the gap between them, which is empty space, your heavy piece of metal, which seems so solid, is 99.999999% empty space. It's only an appearance. Actually, it's mostly empty space. Very close to the illusionism, isn't it? Where is that energy? What makes that energy go? Science stops there. We don't know. What is the nature of the energy? Where did it come from? Why does it flow this way? Those are laws. Who made those laws? Where do the laws exist? What holds the laws and makes them act? We don't know. That's for philosophers to speculate. But at this point, what has science told you? There is a reality. And then there is the phenomenon of the reality. And between the two are layers and layers of phenomena. And as you cut through with your microscope, you are as if approaching the deeper reality. And when you see it, it is completely different from the appearance. Well, the yogi says the same thing. If you go deeper and deeper from that appearance, you discover, remove coverings, but discover layer by layer the reality which is more and more real until you experience it. And at that point, you experience the universe for what it actually is, the reality of energy and consciousness and the bliss of the Satchidananda and its sheer existence of divinity. In this, the reality is seen as abstract, impersonal, universal. And you are now entering the experience of reality. So this is the first approach of pure spiritual consciousness. In the second movement, the yogi says, look, as you go deeper in the unveiling of layers, you're approaching reality. What do you discover? Because in your introverted process, you are the reality, or you experience your oneness with the reality. And you discover that reality which is everywhere in the universe is the same within you. It is your true self. And right here on the surface where you said I exist, that's your false appearance or distorted phenomenon. And as you went deeper, you discovered your self, except your self was the same as the self of all things and of the whole universe. It's one self. And so this is the second approach to true spiritual consciousness. You discover it, uncover it as self. And obviously the outcome of this perception is it is the self in all, and you actually experience I am essentially in all things. I am everywhere. And in this you discover the aspect of the universality of the first experience. Everything is one whole universal reality, of which I am an aspect, a special aspect, or I am equally in all. A very different approach, and yet in the end they come to the same, or they're aspects of the same. And then there is the third approach, where as I dwell upon this reality, I discover the reality is utterly existent, but also utterly conscious, and power of consciousness to express, to create, to manifest, which is blissful. And when I meet that consciousness, because it is conscious, as I reach out to it, it reaches out to me. As I open myself, it responds. As I call, it responds immediately. And as much as it is within me, it is also outside me. It is also presiding in all the workings of the universe equally. And I begin to have a personal relation with the reality. And as I begin to have the personal relation, I discover that I can have a whole conversation, a whole complex aspect of relationships of all kinds, as if it were another being. Except it's not like another limited human being, it is great being. Not only great being, it is universal being. Not only universal, it extends beyond universe and beyond space and time. It is cosmic or transcendent being. I don't know how to call it anymore, and I will simply say divine being. And that's the third aspect. Or more commonly, they use the word God. Person, being. But so great as to be beyond all description. And yet it starts with a perception of being which was almost human, and then I discovered the true being. So the whole journey of discovery of the reality or of the self is more of a relationship with divine being, which becomes more and more self, because I am that, which becomes more and more this universal and transcendent reality, because all is that. And all three experiences merge into aspects of each other. There are three aspects in which you can approach the divine. And you do not know the spiritual consciousness entirely until you know it in all three aspects. And so he says, the urge of the consciousness towards that, towards contact with the reality, the self or the divine being, that must be the first and foremost of the urge. Towards contact with that. And you begin with contact, wherever, whatever form, however limited. That has to be the first and foremost. Or even, he pushes it one step further. Till it is perfectly accomplished, the sole preoccupation of the spiritual seeker. And now we come to another profound insight of the spiritual journey. Till you reach it entirely, this should be your sole preoccupation, because after you've reached it entirely, your preoccupation is no more this or yours. When you reach it entirely, your only preoccupation is its preoccupation. And what is its preoccupation? Sri Aurobindo jokes with a profound insight. If being obsessed with yourself is selfishness, the divine is the most selfish being, because its only preoccupation is himself, because all is himself. And what's your preoccupation when you are one with him is his preoccupation that you serve. But till then, it is your sole preoccupation to realize him, grow in contact, in immersion. But then he says, it's the foremost, but it's also, till it's perfectly accomplished, the sole preoccupation of the spiritual seeker. Why? And the deep insight is this. If it was not your sole preoccupation, let's say a part of me seeks the divine, a part of me seeks something else, what happens? The thing which seeks the something else pulls away or breaks up or becomes the hanging on weight that drags and prevents precisely the problem which we saw before, for which you wanted this one-pointed focus. If on the other hand it's my sole preoccupation, all of me is aligned, nothing resisting, there is the surge, not only the surge, a leap, but there is also the contact and the immersion and the merging and the realization. But as long as something is not given to the realization, there cannot be realization. There will be experience and then the fall from experience. And again a struggle of experience and a fall and the continual oscillation. And therefore you see, in the early days of the ashram, when the form of the integral yoga had taken the most concentrated collective focus, you had to have this one-pointed exclusive focus. To the extent that nothing you owned in the world. You see the commonality with the ascetic approach, and yet it was not ascetic. It was life-embracing. All activities of life were represented. Everything you owned was the divine's. And so physically it took the form you came, you gave everything to the mother and Sri Aurobindo. Nothing left. And then they gave you back what you need for your sadhana. But they gave not only the physical form of it, well, your clothing, your place to stay, your little bicycle and the food, but with it, because they gave it back, it was the divine consciousness giving through those forms the divine influx. Now it was no more a bicycle, it was mother's bicycle. Now it was no more a house, it was mother's house. It was no more a pen, the mother gave me this pen. And everything was suffused with the spiritual presence. And the food you ate was filled with mother's consciousness because she has made it and given it to you. Will you waste it? And of course, bit by bit, the gaps begin to form. Now there are intermediary steps. Now it's no more mother who gives it, it is Dyuman Bhai who is in charge. So Dyuman Bhai gives it on behalf of the mother because the mother is too busy physically to be giving it to you personally. So still the mother kept the contact for a long time. Every month you had what was written, what was called the prosperity chit. You wrote what you needed. I need a new pair of shoes. I need this to be repaired. I need my clothes to be stitched. It was put in a little box. It would go through the whole system and the mother would personally give you on the first of the month the clothes you needed, and you wore them as given by the mother. Of course, when she withdrew, now it was somebody else, Harikant Patel, who gives you the clothes. And quickly these gaps begin to form and I go, hi, how are you? I take my box of clothes. And I forgot that it was the mother who was giving it. Now it's become a personal relationship. Can you please add this? And the fellow says no. And I say, oh, this fellow is so bad. He doesn't understand. They had a rule that an umbrella had to last 10 years. So if you lost it in between, you had to go and say you lost it. And they would say, no, sorry, until your 10 years are over, we don't give it to you. Would mother say that? No. She went to the mother and said, I lost my umbrella. She would say, all right. But the man in between is not mother. So suddenly all these human elements begin to come in between and you forget the whole point of the exercise. And the exercise becomes more and more mechanical, ritualistic. Oh, first of the month I have to go and get my prosperity. I get my little box with a little piece of soap. And it's not the very best soap either. But, well, you're doing your ritual. It's lost its force, it's lost its meaning. But if you go back to the principle behind and the full value it had, suddenly your life was filled with and ruled only by your constant immersion in the divine presence and contact with the divine. And everything you did was suffused with the mother's consciousness. The work you did, she came, saw. You created something, you gave it to her. Everywhere it was that. But when she withdrew from the physical contact daily, things fell apart. Unless you made the effort to make that contact. And if you make that one small effort, everything is as before. But if you don't make that effort, then the gaps begin to form. And even today, if you take it in that spirit, everything you own including maybe you have spent your personal money to buy a mobile phone, that personal money was never yours, is never yours. Look at it practically. Where did you get it? Did you make it? No. You got it. From whom? And if you look at it truly, it came from the mother through XYZ instruments. And if it was Harikant Patel who gave you the prosperity box, you recognize behind it was the mother who authorized him to do this. And if he has a bit of a barrier on not giving you your umbrella, well, you say that's his problem, not mother. My relationship is with the mother. She will give me the umbrella another way, or I will find my way to manage it with her help. And she does, inevitably. And so if you can cut through the forms of appearances and begin to relate to the divine, you will find very quickly you can come back to this soul preoccupation of the spiritual seeker. And when you're able to do that, the sadhana enormously speeds up. Because now there are not all these artificial separate pulls and pushes and drives, which, as we have seen before, either compromise or they mix, make imperfect or dilute or block. So the point he makes, now you will see, is very close to the form of the ascetic ideal. No compromise in your exclusive dedication to the divine, except that in the form it cut off from mind, life, body, and so it lost even an aspect of the divine truth. But in the passage of human evolution, that was necessary in order to develop some kind of an exclusive focus from which the second movement could begin. So he says, it is the one thing needful that has to be done by each on whatever line is possible to him. So obviously we can't say all of me can enter it. I can't. But I start with what's possible. And in each one there's a different line. For me it starts with my perception of thought, or it starts with my heart's turn, or it starts with my consecration of work. Or it starts in this one activity where I go every evening and sweep the floor of the ashram, or the footpath of the ashram, or the floor of my house, which is given by the mother and owned by her, as is my bank account, or everything else. And bit by bit, you start with the thing where it becomes possible and then widen out. The one thing needful that has to be done by each on whatever line is possible to him. By each according to the spiritual capacity developed in his nature. And now we come to something quite extraordinary, which Aurobindo will elaborate in the next paragraph. Each one has a capacity developed in your nature by past evolution. Start with that. And you understand the last 2,500 years of the ascetic phase, or the life-renouncing phase, or the illusionism and all the rest. It was necessary because it assisted in developing some part of our nature. And some of this you have inherited in your culture, or in your family tradition, or in something of your even heredity, or whatever form it is. Or your soul has brought an imprint which is distinct, built over past evolutions of this work, of exclusive dedication, through that limited and distorted form of the renunciation of the ascetic. The phrase he has used, the solitary, the ascetic, the standard bearer of the spirit, and ochre robe as your flag. And having been through this phase, whatever our soul has built up through it, it brings into this life. And what is that imprint? What part of you, in what activity, in what form, in what way of expression does it turn to the divine? Start with that. And here, Aurobindo will elaborate, which we will take up next Sunday. In the course of evolution, in the course of the evolution of the spiritual being, nature has developed broadly 4 lines of the awakening of the inner being. And he lists them like this: religion, occultism, spiritual thought, and inner spiritual realization of and experience. All 4 are entryways to the spirit. And these are the fourfold imprints within us also, in a sense. And we will see how in the next paragraph, historically, these four have sometimes supported each other, opposed each other, but eventually it's the fourth which is the way, using the other three as support. And how this represents itself in us today. There are parts in us which have a religious turn, parts in us which have an occult perception, parts in us which have this spiritual thought. And then there is a part where there is the inner experience turning, growing. All four. Or which of these four is your starting point? Well, you begin with that. But so we will take that up in detail next Sunday. But these last two sentences where he discusses what is necessary today for us, we can reread this and meditate on it for a few minutes. In the coming few days, we will be preparing for Sri Aurobindo's birthday. And the Darshan day was one of those special occasions where you went to meet Sri Aurobindo and the mother in a physical darshan. In the human perspective, you have their darshan, that is, you see them. But actually what's happening is they see you. And in their seeing, they imprint their consciousness into you. Even if you went with eyes closed, what is important is that they see you, isn't it? Because that's how they transmit the experience. Whether you do it in your act of going and visiting Sri Aurobindo's room, or whether you sit in your own room and open before them that they may see you, open yourself entirely that they may see you. Anyway, they will see you entirely, but they may see you in the way you reveal yourself as freely as you can. It is in that moment that there will be that transmission, and that will be your point of contact with their consciousness. And so we can prepare ourselves in this manner for that contact. So we'll read these lines again. So he speaks of the dual tendency for the part to realize the divine at all, the spiritual consciousness at all costs, and then the push and extension of the spirit in our nature. But until the first is fully achieved, the second can only be imperfect and halting. It is the foundation of the pure spiritual consciousness that is the first object in the evolution of the spiritual man. And it is this and the urge of that consciousness towards contact with the reality, the self, or the divine being that must be the first and foremost. It's your first impulse, it's also the foremost. Of all impulses, it is the one in the front. That must be the first and foremost, or even, till it is perfectly accomplished, the sole preoccupation of the spiritual seeker. 3 words. First occupation of the spiritual seeker. Second, foremost occupation of the spiritual seeker. Third, sole occupation of the spiritual seeker. Dwell on what these 3 mean. Internalize these 3 in the attitude you have towards the spiritual awakening and realization. It must be the first and foremost, or even the sole preoccupation of the spiritual seeker. It is the one thing needful that has to be done by each, on whatever line is possible to him, by each according to the spiritual capacity developed in his nature. We can meditate on this for a few minutes.